Sarah Martinez adjusted her worn baseball cap and pulled her jacket tighter as she settled into seat 12A on Flight 447 from Dallas to Boston. The red-eye flight was packed with business travelers and families, but she preferred the window seat where she could watch the city lights fade below. At 52, she had learned to appreciate quiet moments like these. The woman sitting next to her in 12B was dressed in an expensive suit, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on her phone screen. She glanced at Sarah with barely concealed disdain, taking in the faded jeans, the simple sneakers, and the backpack that had seen better days. Sarah noticed the look but said nothing. She had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years. Behind them, a group of young businessmen were discussing their latest deals in loud voices, clearly wanting everyone to hear about their success. One of them, a man in his 30s with slicked back hair, kept glancing at Sarah and making comments to his friends about how some people shouldn't be flying first class. His voice carried enough for several rows to hear. "I mean, look at her," he whispered loudly to his colleague. "Probably using food stamps to pay for that ticket." His friends chuckled, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of judgment settling around her like a heavy blanket. She had experienced this countless times before, but it never got easier. The flight attendant, a young woman named Jessica, approached with the drink service. She was professional and courteous to everyone, but Sarah noticed how the other passengers seemed to light up when speaking with her, while barely acknowledging Sarah's presence. When Jessica asked what she would like to drink, Sarah simply requested water with a quiet, "Please and thank you." The businessman behind her made another comment about people who don't belong in certain places, and Sarah saw Jessica's face tighten slightly. The flight attendant clearly heard the remarks but continued with her duties professionally. Sarah appreciated that Jessica treated her with the same respect she showed everyone else, despite what others might think. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to rest. The long flight ahead would give her time to think about the ceremony waiting for her in Boston. Few people knew why she was making this journey, and she preferred it that way. Recognition had never been something she sought, even when she probably deserved it most. The man in the expensive seat across the aisle was now openly staring at her, clearly puzzled by her presence in first class. He leaned over to his wife and whispered something that made her turn to look as well. Sarah had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was simply to ignore such behavior. But tonight felt different somehow. She thought about the letter in her backpack, the official invitation that had brought her on this flight. The ceremony planners had offered to arrange transportation, but she had declined, preferring to make her own way as she always had. Independence was something she valued highly, even when it meant facing uncomfortable situations like this one. 2 hours into the flight, turbulence began shaking the aircraft. What started as minor bumps quickly escalated into serious jolts that had passengers gripping their armrests. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a sharp ding, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, asking everyone to remain seated. The businesswoman next to Sarah had gone pale, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious fear. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, trying to send what looked like worried messages to someone on the ground. The group of loud businessmen behind them had fallen silent, their boastful conversation replaced by nervous glances out the windows. Sarah remained calm, her breathing steady and controlled. She had experienced far worse situations than airplane turbulence, though the other passengers didn't know that. Her composure seemed to stand out among the growing anxiety in the cabin, and several people began to notice her unusual calmness. The turbulence worsened, causing overhead bins to rattle and personal items to slide across tray tables. A child started crying several rows back, and the flight attendants were struggling to maintain their balance while checking on passengers. Jessica passed by their row, offering reassurance to the clearly frightened woman in 12B. "It's just weather," Sarah said quietly to her seatmate, her voice steady and reassuring. "The pilots know what they're doing." Her tone carried a confidence that seemed to come from experience rather than hope. The businesswoman looked at her with surprise, perhaps noticing for the first time that Sarah appeared completely unafraid. The man who had been making disparaging comments earlier was now gripping his seat, his face pale and sweaty. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by genuine fear as the plane continued to shake violently. He kept looking around desperately, as if searching for someone who might provide comfort or answers. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom again, this time with more urgency. He explained they were encountering unexpected severe weather and would need to change course to avoid the worst of the storm. His words were professional but carried an undertone that suggested this was more serious than routine turbulence. Sarah noticed that Jessica was having trouble staying upright as she tried to secure loose items in the galley. Without hesitation, Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, moving with sure footing despite the aircraft's violent movements. She helped Jessica secure several items that were sliding around, her movements precise and confident. "You should sit down," Jessica said with concern, but she was clearly grateful for the assistance. Sarah's ability to move normally in conditions that had everyone else frozen in fear was remarkable. Other passengers were now watching her openly, their earlier judgment replaced by curiosity and growing respect. The woman in 12B grabbed Sarah's arm as she returned to her seat. "How are you so calm?" she asked, her voice shaking. For the first time since boarding, she was looking at Sarah not with disdain but with genuine human connection, fear having stripped away her earlier prejudices. The turbulence continued for another 20 minutes, during which Sarah became an unexpected source of calm for nearby passengers. She spoke quietly to the frightened woman beside her, sharing breathing techniques that seemed to work remarkably well. Her voice carried an authority that came from having faced real danger before, though she never mentioned specifics. "Focus on something you can control," she told the businesswoman. "Your breathing, the feeling of your feet on the floor. The pilots have handled worse than this." Her words were simple but effective, and gradually the woman's panic began to subside. Other passengers nearby found themselves listening to Sarah's quiet coaching, drawing comfort from her steady presence. The businessman who had been mocking her earlier was now openly staring, no longer with derision but with something approaching awe. He had never seen anyone remain so composed under pressure, and it was clear that Sarah possessed some kind of training or experience that went far beyond what her appearance suggested. Jessica approached their row again, this time specifically to check on Sarah. "Thank you for helping earlier," she said quietly. "Are you military?" It was a question born of recognition rather than curiosity. Flight attendants often developed an eye for spotting current and former service members, and something about Sarah's bearing had caught Jessica's attention. Sarah simply nodded, not elaborating. She had learned that sometimes the less said, the better. Her service was not something she discussed casually, especially not with strangers on airplanes. But Jessica's knowing look suggested she understood there was much more to the story. As the plane finally broke through the storm into calmer air, passengers began to relax visibly. The captain announced they were through the worst of it and would be continuing to Boston as scheduled. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin, followed by nervous laughter and the resumption of quiet conversations. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. Where before Sarah had been ignored or looked down upon, now several passengers were glancing at her with respect and curiosity. Her behavior during the crisis had revealed something that her appearance had hidden, and people were beginning to reassess their initial judgments. The woman in 12B turned to Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for how I looked at you when you sat down. I was wrong." It was a moment of genuine human connection, the kind that sometimes emerges from shared adversity. Sarah accepted the apology graciously, understanding that fear often strips away pretense. The businessman behind them had gone quiet, his earlier commentary replaced by what appeared to be shame. He kept glancing at Sarah as if trying to work up the courage to say something, but the words seemed to escape him. His friends too had noticed the shift and were no longer participating in their earlier mockery. As the flight continued smoothly toward Boston, Sarah pulled out a worn paperback book and began to read. But she could feel the weight of curious eyes upon her. Passengers who were now wondering what they had missed about the quiet woman in seat 12A. The answer to that question would prove to be far more extraordinary than any of them could have imagined. An hour before landing, Captain Rodriguez left the cockpit for his routine cabin walk. As an experienced pilot with over 20 years of flying, he made it a practice to check on passengers personally after difficult weather. He moved through the aisles with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, speaking briefly with flight attendants and offering reassurance to any passengers who still seemed shaken. When he reached row 12, Jessica quietly pointed toward Sarah. "Captain, I think you should meet this passenger," she said in a low voice. "She was incredible during the turbulence. Helped keep everyone calm. Helped me secure the galley. I think she's military." Captain Rodriguez looked at Sarah with professional interest. He was a former Air Force pilot himself and had developed an eye for recognizing fellow service members. Something about Sarah's posture, her alertness even while reading, and the way she had remained composed during the crisis all suggested military training. "Ma'am," he said, approaching her seat. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. I understand you were quite helpful during our rough patch earlier." Sarah looked up from her book, meeting his eyes directly. There was something in her gaze that made him pause, a depth of experience that seemed disproportionate to her quiet demeanor. "Just did what anyone would do," Sarah replied simply, but Captain Rodriguez knew better. Most passengers would have been paralyzed with fear during turbulence that severe. The fact that she had moved around the cabin helping others suggested training that went far beyond civilian experience. "Mind if I ask what branch?" he inquired quietly, recognizing a fellow veteran. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then said simply, "Army. Long time ago." Her tone suggested the conversation should end there, but Captain Rodriguez found himself curious. Something about her presence felt significant in a way he couldn't quite place. The woman in 12B, who had been listening to their exchange, suddenly spoke up. "She saved us all," she said emotionally. "I was having a panic attack and she talked me through it. She knew exactly what to do." Other passengers nearby nodded in agreement, and Captain Rodriguez began to understand that Sarah's impact during the crisis had been more significant than he initially realized. Captain Rodriguez was about to return to the cockpit when something made him look at Sarah more carefully. Her face seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. It was an odd feeling, like encountering someone famous but being unable to remember their name or how you knew them. "I'm sorry," he said, "but have we met before? You look familiar." Sarah shook her head politely, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was accustomed to this kind of recognition, though she preferred to avoid it. As Captain Rodriguez walked back toward the cockpit, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Sarah's face continued to nag at him, and he found himself mentally reviewing places where he might have encountered her. Military ceremonies, award presentations, news reports. Something was tugging at his memory. Back in the cockpit, he mentioned to his co-pilot that there was an interesting passenger in 12A, a veteran who had helped during the turbulence. But even as he said it, he felt like he was understating something significant. There was more to Sarah Martinez than met the eye, and Captain Rodriguez was beginning to suspect that her story was far more remarkable than her humble appearance suggested. 30 minutes before landing, Captain Rodriguez was reviewing the flight manifest on his tablet when something caught his eye. He had been thinking about the passenger in 12A all evening, and decided to look up her name to see if that might trigger his memory. When he found Sarah Martinez on the list, he decided to do a quick internet search on his tablet. What he found made him freeze completely. The first search result was a military news article with a photograph that made his breath catch in his throat. The woman in the photo was younger, wearing dress uniform with an extraordinary array of ribbons and medals, but it was unmistakably the same person sitting quietly in seat 12A. The headline read, "Medal of Honor recipient Sarah Martinez retires." After 25 years of distinguished service, Captain Rodriguez read further, his eyes widening with each paragraph. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Purple Heart recipient, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, and finally, the Medal of Honor for actions that had saved the lives of 37 soldiers during an ambush in Kandahar. The article described how then Sergeant Martinez had single-handedly held off enemy forces for over 4 hours, despite being wounded, while calling in medical evacuations for her injured comrades. She had refused evacuation herself until every other soldier was safely evacuated. The citation mentioned her extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. Captain Rodriguez felt his hands trembling slightly as he continued reading. This wasn't just any veteran sitting in his cabin. This was one of the most decorated soldiers of her generation, a living legend whose actions had been studied in military academies around the world. And she was traveling alone in simple clothes, treated with disrespect by passengers who had no idea they were in the presence of genuine heroism. He showed the article to his co-pilot, who read it with growing amazement. "She's sitting right out there," the co-pilot whispered. And those passengers were treating her like she didn't belong. The irony was profound. People who had probably never served their country were looking down on someone who had literally put her life on the line for their freedom. Captain Rodriguez realized why her face had seemed familiar. He had seen her photograph before in military publications and during his own service training. Sarah Martinez was legendary in military circles, her story taught as an example of courage under fire and leadership in impossible circumstances. The more he read, the more impressed he became. After receiving the Medal of Honor, she had continued serving, mentoring young soldiers and leading training programs. She had turned down numerous opportunities for publicity and speaking engagements, preferring to serve quietly. Even in retirement, she worked with veteran organizations, helping other former service members transition to civilian life. Looking at the manifest again, Captain Rodriguez noticed that her destination was Boston, where he now remembered a special ceremony was being held at the Veterans Affairs Office. The pieces were falling into place. She was probably traveling to receive some kind of recognition or to participate in a veterans event. Captain Rodriguez made a decision. The passengers on his flight had unknowingly been in the presence of an American hero, and while he couldn't violate her privacy by announcing her identity, he felt compelled to ensure she received the respect she deserved. He thought carefully about how to handle this delicate situation, knowing that Sarah clearly preferred to travel without attention or fanfare. The revelation changed everything about the flight for Captain Rodriguez. Every time he thought about the passengers who had been dismissive of Sarah, he felt a surge of protectiveness. This woman had earned more respect than most people could imagine, and yet she sat quietly asking for nothing, bothering no one, treating everyone with kindness despite their prejudice. Captain Rodriguez left the cockpit once more, but this time his steps carried a different weight. He walked directly to row 12, his expression serious and purposeful. The casual atmosphere in the cabin shifted as passengers sensed something significant was happening. His military bearing was more pronounced now, as if he were approaching a superior officer. When he reached Sarah's seat, he stood at attention beside her row. Sarah looked up from her book and their eyes met with mutual recognition, not of personal acquaintance but of shared service and understanding. She could see in his face that he knew exactly who she was. "Ma'am," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying across the nearby rows, "I need to apologize." The formal tone caught the attention of passengers throughout the first-class cabin. Even the flight attendants paused in their preparations for landing to listen. "You have nothing to apologize for, Captain," Sarah said quietly, understanding immediately what had happened. She had hoped to travel anonymously, but sometimes recognition was inevitable. She appreciated that he was handling it with military courtesy rather than making a spectacle. "Yes, ma'am, I do," Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice growing stronger. "The passengers on this aircraft have been in the presence of one of America's greatest heroes tonight, and they didn't know it. That includes me, and I should have recognized you immediately." The cabin had gone completely silent now. Even passengers several rows away were straining to hear the conversation. The businessman who had been making rude comments earlier was leaning forward, his face growing pale as he began to understand that something extraordinary was unfolding. Captain Rodriguez turned slightly to address the nearby passengers directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that the woman you've been sharing this flight with is Sergeant Major Sarah Martinez, recipient of the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for valor in combat that our nation can bestow." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The woman in 12B covered her mouth with her hands, tears instantly forming in her eyes. The group of businessmen who had been so dismissive earlier looked absolutely stricken, their faces showing a mixture of shame and disbelief. "Sergeant Major Martinez," Captain Rodriguez continued, "served 5 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. She saved the lives of 37 soldiers during an ambush in Kandahar, holding off enemy forces for over 4 hours while wounded, refusing evacuation until every one of her soldiers was safe." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This was exactly the kind of attention she had hoped to avoid, but she understood Captain Rodriguez's motivations. Sometimes education was necessary, even when it was personally uncomfortable for her. The businessman from earlier suddenly stood up, his face flushed with embarrassment and shame. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaking, "I owe you an apology. I said terrible things and I had no right. I'm sorry." His contrition was genuine and complete, a man confronting the ugliness of his own prejudice. Other passengers began to respond as well. Some stood, others applauded quietly. The woman in 12B was crying openly now, reaching over to touch Sarah's arm gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for your service, and thank you for being kind to me even after how I treated you." Captain Rodriguez wasn't finished. His voice carried the weight of authority and respect as he made one final statement that would change how everyone on that flight viewed courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism. "This woman," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying throughout the now silent cabin, "is not just a soldier. She's a living legend. What happened in Kandahar is studied in military academies around the world. But more than that, after receiving our nation's highest honor, she continued to serve quietly, mentoring young soldiers, asking for no recognition, seeking no fame." He paused, looking directly at Sarah with profound respect. She retired last year after 25 years of service, and even now, she works with veteran organizations, helping other former service members. The ceremony she's traveling to attend in Boston is to receive the Distinguished Public Service Award for her continued dedication to helping others. Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Captain, with respect, I was just doing my job. My soldiers, those brave men and women who served alongside me, they're the real heroes. I was just lucky enough to bring them home." Her humility in the face of such recognition only added to the impact of the moment. The transformation in the cabin was complete. Passengers who had judged Sarah based on her appearance were now seeing her through entirely different eyes. The businessman who had been so cruel earlier was visibly emotional, clearly struggling with the weight of his earlier behavior. Jessica, the flight attendant, approached with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, would you allow us to move you to first class for the remainder of the flight?" she asked. Sarah smiled gently and shook her head. "I'm perfectly comfortable right here, thank you. But I appreciate the thought." As the plane began its descent into Boston, something beautiful happened. Passengers throughout the cabin began approaching Sarah's row, not for selfies or autographs, but simply to shake her hand and say thank you. Each interaction was brief and respectful, understanding that she valued her privacy. The woman in 12B, whose name was Margaret, had composed herself enough to speak. "I work in corporate training," she said to Sarah. "I teach people about unconscious bias and making assumptions about others. Today I learned that I still have work to do on myself. Thank you for that lesson." Captain Rodriguez made one final announcement as they approached landing. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for arrival in Boston, I want to remind everyone that heroes walk among us every day. They don't always look like what we expect, and they rarely seek recognition for their service. The lesson tonight is that we should treat everyone with respect and dignity, because we never know what someone has sacrificed for our freedom." After landing, something unprecedented happened. As passengers disembarked, they naturally formed an honor corridor in the jetway, allowing Sarah to walk through while they stood in respectful silence. Some passengers saluted, others simply nodded with deep respect. It was a spontaneous gesture of gratitude that reduced many to tears. Captain Rodriguez waited at the cockpit door to personally thank Sarah as she left. "Ma'am, it was an honor to have you aboard my aircraft. Thank you for your service, and thank you for handling tonight with such grace." Sarah paused at the threshold of the aircraft and turned back briefly. The passengers who had judged her so harshly at the beginning of the flight were now looking at her with newfound understanding and respect. She had taught them all a valuable lesson about the danger of making assumptions about people based on appearances. As she walked through Logan Airport toward baggage claim, Sarah reflected on the flight. While she preferred anonymity, perhaps tonight's events had served a purpose. Sometimes it took a moment of recognition to remind people that heroism comes in many forms, and that the most extraordinary people often lead the most ordinary-looking lives. The ceremony tomorrow would honor her continued service to veterans, but tonight had provided its own kind of recognition. The understanding that respect should be given freely, not earned through revelation of accomplishments. It was a lesson that would stay with everyone who had been aboard Flight 447. a reminder that we should treat each person we meet as if they might be carrying an extraordinary story, because very often they are.